Hello, this is Rambutan here. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Apologies for the noise. There's huge construction going on upstairs. My first video to go viral was this one where I talked about how the vegan movement in India needs to address the issues of caste, class, religion, and access. And overnight, my comments and DMs were filled with so much abuse that I had to block around 150 plus people that very night. If you go look at the comment section of that reel, you will see that I've tried to engage in good faith, writing literal essays as replies. In this long form video, I'll elaborate on the ideas discussed on the reel. I want to begin with the reaction that I got on the reel because it told me something about the subject. A lot of people were angry that I had disturbed the moral comfort of a certain kind of vegan politics, the kind that wants to speak about compassion while refusing to sit with caste. The kind that wants to speak about animals while refusing to speak about workers that make their vegan food happen. The kind that wants to speak about non-violence while refusing to look at the violence already attached to food in India. The point I made was simple. Animal suffering and industrial farming are brutal and they have no place in our society. Corporate dairy also deserves serious criticism. The way we have built food systems around extraction and endless consumption has no ethical innocence. But the thing is, in India and in South Asia, food is never only food. Food is caste, food is religion, food is class, food is housing, food smells. Food decides who gets invited to a kitchen, who gets denied a flat, who gets watched by a landlord, who gets mocked in a hostel, who gets lynched on a highway, who gets told their lunchbox is dirty, whose grandmother's food is called uncivilized, and whose body is treated as polluted because of what their community eats. In this video, I will do three things. First, I want to take seriously the ethical argument that animals suffer and that industrial animal agriculture deserves opposition. Second, I want to show why veganism in India becomes politically dangerous when it forgets caste, class, religion, and access. Third, I want to ask what a better politics could look like. A politics that opposes animal cruelty without reproducing caste purity, that cares about food without humiliating the poor who are denied access to food in general, that speaks of compassion without turning Dalit, Muslim, Christian, Adivasi, Bahujan, and Southern and Northeast India's food cultures into communities' moral failures. Let me start with something that happened in March 2024. Zomato announced a pure veg delivery feed. And I know some people will say that I'm conflating veganism with vegetarianism. I will come to that point. I am setting the overall context for this video here. Coming back, the designated uniforms for these Zomato delivery agents were going to be green, as the idea was that vegetarian orders would be handled separately. Zomato scrapped the green uniform idea after online backlash as critics saw the move as deepening caste divides. The company's own CEO, Dibendra Goyal, later said that the red uniform writers could be mistakenly associated with non-vegetarian food and blocked by gated communities, and that there could be safety concerns for riders and customers. So I just want us to sit with that image. A delivery worker wearing a certain color uniform enters a gated community. The worker's body becomes the carrier of someone else's food anxiety. The uniform becomes a caste and religious signal, while the food packet has become a social risk. This is what I mean when I say food politics in India cannot be reduced to individual ethics. When Zomato calls it pure veg, or you must have seen it in 100 other restaurants in your city call themselves pure veg, the social meaning of that purity travels through old hierarchies. It travels through the idea that some food are clean, others are polluting, that some kitchen are acceptable and others are very suspect. Some bodies can enter a building and others have to explain themselves. The pure in the pure veg signals caste purity. A few months later, another example appeared. During a religious procession pilgrimage, police orders in Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand that eateries along the pilgrimage routes are now to display the names of their owners. India's Supreme Court suspended those orders. A lot of critics feared that the orders would enable discrimination against Muslims, while the court said that restaurants may indicate the kind of food served but could not be forced to display the owner's identities. Again, look at the scene before entering theory. You have to display the name of the owner, if they are Hindu, Muslim, or whatever. The state is enabling a customer to decide whether the food is acceptable before tasting it, before seeing the kitchen. Do you see how the issue of food in India becomes a technology of suspicion? The state does not have to say avoid Muslim shops for the social message to travel. It only has to make identity visible at the point of consumption. And I believe that these two examples should sit at the beginning of any serious conversation about veganism in India. Because if pure veg uniform can endanger a delivery worker, and if a restaurant's owner's name can become a site of communal sorting, then the vegan movement cannot pretend that food labels enter a neutral society. They enter a society where food has already been used to rank, to exclude, to punish. Again, please wait for me to make the connection between veganism and vegetarianism, because in India, vegetarianism has rarely been a dietary choice. It has also functioned as a status claim. It has functioned as an upper caste social language. It has functioned through housing ads that say vegetarians only, hostel rules, school lunch debates where eggs are removed because dominant groups object, and families that treat kitchen as caste borders. Pew's 2021 survey complicates the popular imagination of India as a naturally vegetarian country. 61% of Indians said that they were not vegetarian, and vegetarianism varied sharply by region, religion, and caste location. General category Hindus were more likely to be vegetarian than scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and vegetarianism was much lower among Muslims, Christians, and many regional communities. This data is important because the moral image of India as vegetarian often speaks from the location of power. It turns one community's food practice into national culture and then treats everyone else as deviation. It makes vegetarian food appear universal and commonsensical, and meat appear particular. Almurli Natarajan's work on beef festivals makes this point sharply. He argues that casteism constructs vegetarian food as a kind of casteless universal, while beef is made into caste particular, attached to Dalits, Muslim, Christians, and racialized northeastern communities. I think that line explains so much of Indian politics. A paneer dish can be treated as normal food. A vegetarian canteen becomes a neutral space. A meat serving canteen becomes controversial. A pure veg restaurant becomes respectable. This is why veganism in India has to be careful about the moral language it inherits. Veganism and vegetarianism are different at the level of diet. Veganism rejects dairy, eggs, and other animal products. Vegetarianism may continue to rely on milk, curd, ghee, paneer. Food Safety Authority of India even has a separate vegan food regulations notified in 2022 with guidelines for vegan logos and approvals. But in public life, especially among urban upper caste, upper class Indians, veganism can still borrow the emotional grammar of purity. It can sound like clean eating. It can slide towards disgust towards meat. The slide is dangerous because disgust has a social history. Dolly Kikon's work on dirty food is important here. She shows how racism and casteism in India operate through food-based disgust towards northeastern communities, where their foods are called smelly, dirty, uncivilized, or contaminating. Her concept of ganda food helps us understand how upper caste ideas of hygiene, superiority travel into racialized everyday life. I want you to think of a Northeast student in Delhi opening a container of fermented food in hostel. Think of someone saying the smell is unbearable. Think of landlords objecting to cooking practices. I want you to think of neighbors treating akhuni, pork, beef, smoked meat, dried fish, and fermented bamboo shoot as proof of backwardness. Here, taste becomes a language through which mainland India disciplines community it already sees outside the national norm. And I think the Nagaland dog meat ban revealed this civilizing gaze very clearly. Scroll's essay on the ban argues that mainland India continues to try to civilize Nagas by judging their food practices through dominant moral compass, and it connected this to older colonial ways of describing Nagas as barbaric. Again, that does not mean that every food practice is beyond ethical discussion. It means ethical discussion becomes violent when it begins from disgust, racial hierarchy, and the assumption that mainland upper caste norms are the measure of civilization. This is also where militarization enters the plate. A Whittle's essay on Naga food system traces the decline of foraging and indigenous food practices to decades of militarization and counterinsurgency, including AFSPA, which was imposed in the Naga areas in 1958. The essay describes granaries being burnt, curfews preventing cultivation, village displacement, forests becoming spaces of danger and surveillance, and increasing dependence on imported grains. When someone from the mainland says, why can't they just eat plant-based food? The question carries a whole history it refuses to see. It refuses to see land. It refuses to see forest access. It refuses to see militarization, the loss of commons. It refuses to see how indigenous food systems are built through fishing, through gathering, through seasonal knowledge, through fermentation, through preservation and local ecology. A review of indigenous foods in India notes that traditional food systems include harvesting, fishing and gathering. And these foods are tied to culture. They're tied to their identity and well-being. This is why the vegan movement has to listen before it moralizes. Listening does not mean abandoning animals. Listening means asking what conditions produce a community's food system, what nutritional role a food plays, what labor sustains it, and what caste or racial contempt already surrounds it. Now let us move on to the theme of class, because because a lot of vegan discourse uses the phrase plant-based as though it floats above money. A vegan diet can be cheap in some forms. Indian vegan food like dal, rice, chana, rajma, millets, seasonal vegetables, peanuts, coconut, sesame, sprouts, soy chunks, all of this can be affordable in some context. Many working class, Bahujan and Adivasi food practices already contain a lot of plant-based knowledge without needing an English label. But the market version of veganism that circulates through Instagram is often almond milk and oat milk and vegan cheese and mock meat and imported protein smoothies, clean balls and premium packaged product. The price difference is not small. Regular milk can be around 55 to 60 a liter on major Indian grocery platforms, while plant-based milks often sell at several times that price depending on brand and platform. Here again, the price comparison is not the whole politics. And I know that sometimes plant-based milk can be cheaper, but it shows how easily veganism becomes class gated when it is defined by package substitute rather than public nutrition discourse. And food access is never about the price of one item. It is about cooking fuel. It is about time. It's about refrigeration, whether someone lives in a rented room, a shared space, a conflict zone, a household where women can cook after paid labor, or a home where the kitchen itself is controlled by caste. The latest official nutritional intake report shows that calorie intake varies by expenditure group, with the lowest expenditure factor consuming far fewer calories than the higher group. Research on rural India's nutrition diets argues that diet affordability has to be measured against wages, against actual rural prices rather than the abstract nutrient calculation. That is why the eat better can become a cruel sentence when it is spoken without material analysis. Eat better with what? Cook with what fuel? Buy from which market? Spend whose time? Travel how far? Feed how many people? During what season? In whose kitchen? And whose rules? Actually, the India Forum's work on subsidized canteen explains that many marginalized people rely on canteens because they lack cooking facilities, and public canteens can become democratic spaces. It also notes that dry rations alone do not solve hunger because people need fuel, people need kitchen and infrastructure. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to know that this is the level at which food ethics has to operate in India. A serious politics would ask why public canteens are not better funded, why pulses are not more accessible through public systems, why school meals still become a site of caste conflict, why eggs are removed from midday meal programs because dominant groups object, why poor women carry the burden of cooking, and why moral energy is so often spent humiliating the eater rather than transforming the food itself. The labor question pushes this further. India's animal product economy is massive. Government figures describe India as producing about 25% of world's milk, ranking second in egg production and fourth in meat production. So when veganism targets only the consumer, it ignores the fact that the state itself is building the animal economy. It ignores corporations, the feed systems, export market, the cold chains, the dairy cooperatives. It also ignores the workers. Dakshin Foundation report notes that fisheries provide direct employment to about 25 million fishers and fish farmers, and indirect employment to 50 million people across the value chain. It It also documents migrant fish workers facing unsafe conditions. A sort of vegan politics that says stop eating fish without speaking to the fisher livelihoods, without migrant labor, without coastal displacement and climate change is speaking too shallowly. Reporting by the International Dalit Solidarity Network on India's leather industry, it describes how Dalit and Muslim workers are concentrated in exploitative work marked by low wages, child labor, and caste discrimination, with leather work treated as impure caste-based labor. So even when the vegan movement critiques leather consumption, it has to ask who is doing the work and why are they trapped in it, what are their caste histories, what transition looks like when the worker is treated as disposable by both caste society and ethical consumerism. Again, when someone says animals suffer, I agree. When someone says corporate animal agriculture is cruel, the disagreement begins when a political problem is shrunk into the moral purity of the consumer. Now let us talk about individual ethics, because this is where a lot of online discourses get stuck. Ethics is very useful when it tells that animal's pain is real, when the market has trained to see animal as only a product. But ethics becomes politically shallow when it stops at the individual consumer and refuses to move towards institutions, towards state policy, to addressing caste and corporate power. Because if ethics alone was enough, workers would simply explain exploitation to their bosses and tell them what you're doing is wrong, and then the wages would rise. A delivery worker could explain fairness to the platform and suddenly get social security and health insurance. But the world does not work like that, because Power rarely gives a profit or any kind of hierarchy because someone has made a good moral argument. And this is where neoliberalism enters. And I want to explain that word through the plate, not through textbook definition. Neoliberalism is what happens when a society takes problem produced by corporations, example, climate change, and then places the burden of solving it on the individual person standing in the supermarket aisle. Neoliberal understanding would bank on the customer to buy a steel straw, thinking that this will help, but not critique the corporate which is dumping tons of oil into the sea. There is no structural analysis. That's the problem. Neoliberalism says the dairy industry is cruel, so buy a different milk. Factory farming is very cruel, so buy a different protein. Plastic waste is everywhere, so carry a metal straw. Workers are exploited, so choose an ethical brand. The political demand becomes a shopping decision. And this shift feels empowering to the consumers, to us, because it gives the individual a clean action. It also protects the structure because the corporation remains the organizer of choice. The state continues subsidizing and expanding animal product economies. The platform continues extracting workers. And that's why things like carbon footprint, right? They were bought by British Petroleum to put the focus, the onus of responsibility onto us so that we measure our carbon footprint, and they don't do anything. The consumer feels political, while the field of politics has moved from collective struggle to a sort of curated consumption. Food scholars have been writing about this for years. Julie Gutman and Milan Dupuy described neoliberalism as a system that makes people govern themselves through personal responsibility while hiding the economic and political structures shaping their bodies and choices. Their work on food and obesity is about the American context, but the lesson travels that when health, food, morality, all of these are individualized, structural violence becomes a personal failure. Gutman's work on food labels shows how voluntary labels can become a form of market governance, where regulation is displaced into consumer choice rather than enforced through democratic state action. And this is exactly the danger with ethical food politics. The label tells you what kind of a person you can become if you buy correctly. Organic, cruelty-free, vegan, sustainable, local. Some of these labels can point towards actual harm, and some can help people make better choices. There is no doubt. But the label also teaches us to imagine justice as a private purchase. It tells you that moral citizen is the person who can compare, replace, and consume differently. And in a country like India, this immediately becomes a class question because the ability to choose is unevenly distributed. Choice requires money, kitchen access, fuel, refrigeration, and enough stability in life to treat food as a site of self-expression rather than survival. And this is where the vegan movement has to be careful because mainstream veganism can easily become a form of ethical consumerism. Animal suffering becomes real only at the moment of purchase. Politics becomes a matter of substitution. This form of veganism leaves the consumer feeling transformed, while the world that produces violence remains intact. So researchers have called this out in different ways. A study on cruelty-free consumer discourse around PETA and the Vegan Society found that animal rights activism can be shaped through market-centric language that treats activists mainly as middle-class consumers. Alex Sexton's work on big veganism argues that plant-based food has increasingly become tied to corporate agribusiness, where vegan food geographies can reproduce the same food system inequalities they claim to solve. Nathan Clay's work on plant milk calls this palatable disruption. Plant milk allows people to care about animals, while keeping the wider structure of consumer choice smooth and very market friendly. And that phrase is very useful for us. Palatable disruption. It means that a system allows a certain kind of change because the change tastes like continuity. You still buy, you still consume, you still enter the same supermarket. But now the product carries the emotional reward of ethics. The disruption becomes acceptable because it does not ask who owns the land, who controls the chain, who are the workers behind your vegan food, who is the one setting the wages, who gets praised out of nutrition, whose food is called dirty. And this is why I feel uneasy when veganism becomes a moral identity before a political project. Moral identity creates a clean self of sort. Political struggle creates an accountable world. Moral identity is satisfied when the plate changes. Political struggle continues into wages, into school meals and public canteens, into climate policy. And this is also where I want to revisit the boss example. Imagine telling a boss it is unethical to underpay us. The boss may agree in language. The boss may even say we value our employees, but wages change when workers organize, when unions create pressure. Ethics may name the wrong. Power decides whether the wrong continues. So if we understand labor this way, why do we forget about this when we talk about food? Why do we suddenly imagine that corporations will stop producing cruelty because a small group of consumers buy better product? That is the neoliberal trick. It agrees that harm exists. Yes, I agree with you. Then sells you an individual role out of guilt. Neoliberalism allows you to be politically awake without asking you to build political power. Again, I don't want us to fall into a completely binary thinking. This does not mean that individual choices have no meaning. They have meaning. A person reducing animal products, if they are refusing leather and supporting cruelty-free alternatives, they are reducing their participation in violent industries by making a serious ethical effort. See that. But individual choices become politically mature when they refuse the fantasy that market is the main stage of justice. Yes, a plant-based meal can be part of a politics, but a plant-based purchase cannot carry the whole of politics. The Indian context, let's come back, makes this sharper because food morality here is already preloaded with hierarchy. In many Western vegan spaces, the neoliberal problem may look like ethical consumerism, sometimes wellness culture, but in India, all of that exists. Then caste enters the room, religion enters, housing enters, lynching over food consumption enters, pure veg enters. The consumer morality model becomes even more dangerous here because the language of purity can attach itself to the old system of human ranking. When an Indian vegan says this is about compassion, I want to ask, compassion organized how? What, through what institution? At what price? Against which corporation? Does it have an anti-caste commitment? What is its position on criminalization and vigilante policing of meat? With what understanding of Adivasi, Bahujan, Muslim, Christian, and Northeastern food cultures are you moving forward? And what is your plan for workers who are right now in dairy, in leather, in fishing? Because compassion that remains at the level of purchase can become very cruel. It can shame the poor for eating what is available. It can shame marginalized communities for eating what history, what survival have taught them to eat. It can convert animal suffering to an upper caste disgust toward meat-eating people. It can treat access as an excuse rather than material condition. My point here is a better vegan politics would start with structure. It will fight for stronger animal welfare laws against industrial cruelty. It would demand public investment in affordable protein, in pulses, in school meals and community kitchens. It would support workers transitioning out of exploitative animal product industries without treating them as morally contaminated. It would oppose minorities being lynched on the topic of food and take food policing as a central vegan issue, because animal politics in India has already been captured by the majoritarian and right wing. It would treat vegan alternative as one small part of a larger food justice project rather than the whole project itself. And this is where ethics actually becomes useful. Ethics should begin with discomfort. Ethics should ask us to notice the violence hidden inside the normal meals. But ethics has to grow into politics. It has to leave the supermarket aisle and enter the workplace, enter the state, enter the fishing harbor, the ration shop, and the caste order. And that is my point. That is the difference between veganism as a lifestyle and veganism as liberation. Lifestyle veganism asks the consumer to become clean. Liberationist veganism asks the world to become less violent. Let's move on from neoliberalism and ethics point. And now let's talk about the political right in India. Any discussion of veganism in India has to understand how veganism has been co-opted by religious majoritarianism and caste society. Human Rights Watch has documented cow protection violence targeting Muslims and Dalit, including attacks based on rumors of cattle trade. ACLED has also noted that cow protection laws and vigilante attacks have targeted Muslim, Christian, Dalit and Adivasi communities under the language of protecting cattle. This is the reality into which vegan moral language enters. When a vegan activist says meat is murder in abstract, that sentence may sound like animal ethics in Western context. In India, that sentence can echo inside a society where people have been murdered over meat. When someone says non-veg food is disgusting, the sentence may sound like a personal revulsion. I understand. This is why the distinction between veganism and casteist vegetarianism has to be made loudly, repeatedly. Veganism can become anti-caste only when it rejects purity politics as much as it rejects animal cruelty. It has to reject the idea that Dalit, Muslim, Christian, Adivasi, Bahujan, Northeastern food cultures are morally inferior. It has to reject the state's use of cow protection to discipline minorities. It has to build a politics where animal life matters without turning oppressed human communities into the face of violence. Now, a defender of veganism may say animals do not stop suffering because humans suffer too. That is true. Animal suffering deserves attention in its own right. But that begins by condemning marginalized communities will produce defensiveness, will produce caste arrogance and a sort of moral panic. But a movement that begins by attacking industrial cruelty, by attacking the corporates, by attacking corporate profit through state policy, attacking caste purity, it can build something larger. And this is exactly why I'm not arguing against veganism as an ethical possibility. I'm arguing for a veganism that grows up politically. A liberatory vegan politics in India would start by saying industrial animal cruelty has to end, cow purity has to end. It would fight factory farming and pure veg housing discrimination in the same breath. It would also speak about dairy cruelty, also about Dalit Muslim workers in leather, meat, and sanitation economies. It would talk about plant-based foods and also demand public canteens, school meals, cooking fuel, water, housing, refrigeration access. It would speak to consumer. It would speak to fisher communities before making sweeping claims. It would learn from Adivasi and Northeast food systems before calling foods primitive or cruel. It would take animal suffering seriously without allowing the political right to use animal language against minorities. It would also stop treating the individual consumer as the easiest moral target. A person's food choice is absolutely real, no doubt about it, but it is not floating freely in the air. It is produced somewhere. It is in the material reality or conditions of this country. I want us to think is harder than lifestyle purity. It asks more from us. When I made that reel, a lot of vegans heard as an attack. What I was trying to offer was a demand for seriousness. If your veganism cannot speak about caste, it is politically weak. If your veganism cannot speak about class, it is materially weak. If your veganism cannot talk about religion, it is historically weak. If your veganism cannot speak about Northeastern, Adivasi, Dalit, Bahujan, Muslim, and Christian food cultures without discuss, it is ethically weak. If your veganism cannot speak about the labor relations creating your vegan food, it is structurally weak. And if compassion is the word we are using, then compassion has to be large enough to include the animal in the cage, the cow in the dairy system, the chicken in the factory farm, the fish in the trawler net, the Dalit leather worker handling toxic chemical, the Muslim meat worker living under suspicion, the fisherfolk facing debt and climate collapse, the Northeastern student whose food is called dirty, in the Adivasi community whose forest access has been broken. That is my point of the whole video. You cannot make compassion into a premium identity. Compassion has to become rigorous structural politics.